Ann Arbor. And on top of all of this, high taxes, Detroit has the highest property tax rate, the highest water rates, the highest insurance rates. I just learned Sunday at our neighborhood association meeting that Michigan is at the bottom of the list of states on affordable car insurance. We are the only state that doesn't have a regulator committee. So they could charge us all of these astronomical insurance rates based on your age, based on your income, all these other factors that have nothing to do with your driving records. We had grants from HUD that gave people money to fix up their homes, to repair their roofs, get new furnaces, get new windows in, all of this other stuff. And the new mayor that came in, Mr. Duggan, he changed the rule on it so that the mayor would have jurisdiction and control over that money. He turned and took that money, that grant money, and turned it into a low interest loan program that brought in a lot of gentrifiers. There were stipulations on the money regarding credit and things like this, and house insurance stipulation, whatever the stipulations were, that many of the African Americans that live in the city, who worked in the car factories, who worked as teachers, who worked in various forms of labor industry and service sector industries, were losing because of their pensions. They had lost, a chunk of their pensions and things like this. They had paid for their houses, but now, even homeowners that own their homes were, being subjected to high tax.
This sounds so familiar. It seems like they're moving from the playbook because, we experienced in St. Louis, and then I'm going to talk about Puerto Rico, who austerity was introduced before Hurricane Maria. And they said it was 3.5 million people in 2016 who got a financial control board. Then John Paulson, and we know him from the subprime mortgage scandals and vulture funds, acquired 250 condominiums and 46 acres of beachfront property.
Right. Well, that's the same thing that happened here. I mean, Judge Stephen Rhodes, who was a part of the bankruptcy, fabricated bankruptcy of Detroit here, and the takeover of the schools this last go round, ended up being one of the first advisors to Puerto Rico with their bankruptcy. And then they assigned another judge out of New York to deal with it.
Let me read a brief excerpt from Nation of Change. And it says, in January, as part of his government's fiscal plan, Governor Rosolo announced that 305 out of a total of 1,100 schools would be closed. In addition, that was before Hurricane Maria, and then over 150 more closed. And then basically they're moving with charter schools, and that happened in New Orleans. So this is like
we call that the
capital playbook.
Right, we call that the New Orleans plan. When they brought that mess here to close down the schools, to bring in privatized charters and all these other investors to take over the school system. We told them, Detroit is not New Orleans. We did not have a natural disaster. We had an economic disaster that was, invented. And then the same thing, but it's all connected. It's all to, privatize all of the schools. Please, by all means, go to our website, We the People of Detroit. We put out a book, WeThePeopleOfDetroit.com or .org. We put out a book called Mapping the Water Crisis, the Dismantling of African American Neighborhoods. And we have a community research collective that put that book out. I'm on that research collective now. We're working on a second publication dealing with the schools, the dismantling of the schools.
So, Aurora, the format of this show, and for our listeners, We Stay Woke, we often, and on every episode, we try to get activists and organizers to talk about what they're reading.
Okay. Well, I have been reading, Now, this is a gift, a book, the autobiography of Dick Gregory called Nigger. And as I was reading his autobiography, I was trying to make some sense and ground myself, okay, because I already know in the back of my head a lot of things that Dick Gregory would have said in this book and have said in this book are continuing now. And one of the things that struck me came from chapter 8, page 158, and it deals with a man named Clyde Kennard, and he was 35 years old, and he had been in jail, and he had been charged with stealing 5 bags of chicken feed. And he was trying to enroll in the Mississippi Southern College, and they opposed it. So what they did was they planted some chicken feed on his farm, and his stepfather got sick when he went to try to finish his education. He was harassed by the police. They planted the 5 stolen bags of chicken feed on the farm, and the price of the feed was raised to make a charge a felony, and he was sentenced to 7 years at hard labor. And another person admitted to stealing the feed, but the white authorities told him to shut up. And Dick Gregory, talks about these different points of people who had experienced, these different types of violences and things like that, and how these stories were coming from Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was sending him reports on all of these different incidences that were happening down in Mississippi. And it connects to what, has been happening here, with all the protests and things that are going on now and have been going on across the United States. How activists have come up and have you report and you document instead of paper and mimeograph back then. We now have cell phones, fax machines, etc., computers or whatever. But the tragic story about this guy was that he ended up in jail at the age of 35, and by the time Dick Gregory got the story, he was suffering from cancer, and Dick Gregory arranged for this man to get out. There was a millionaire from Chicago that was able to get him released from jail, but when they flew him to Chicago to start the cancer treatments, he looked like he was 85, and then it was too late. 6 months later, he died. So this tragic story, and others, such as in LaFleur County, Mississippi, they had cut off shipments of federal surplus foods, most of it which went to African Americans, and this was in retaliation for voter registration drives in Greenwood, the county seat. Well, this kind of plays into what happened here in Detroit with the shutting off of the water, and the governor at one point of Michigan saying, that we had no right to vote for our elected officials here in Detroit.
Dick Gregory published a book called Nigger in 1967. And that's the book we're talking about. But for folks who don't know Dick Gregory, he is born from St. Louis. And he was one of the most famous and important comedians. And he died recently, August 19, 2017. And people know him for, I don't know if people saw that movie House Party when it was like, go get your Dick Gregory. He was known for being a staunch advocate for Black folks in health. He was also known for protesting the war in Vietnam. And he went on multiple hunger strikes for civil rights and various issues.
I lived in an all-Black neighborhood, and nothing I hate any worse to hear African Americans talking about community. We do not live in a community. They don't know that. A community is where you control your press, you control your money, you control banking and finance, you control the car. We don't control that. We live in a hood. What is a hood? Something you put over your face when you're trying to hide something. They don't know that. Huh?
Okay. It says here, Kennard was born Clyde Kennard, was born in Mississippi, and he attended the University of Chicago. When he got out of the paratroopers after Korea, he bought his parents a farm in Mississippi. His stepfather got sick, and Clyde went down to run the farm. He wanted to finish his college education, so in 1959, he applied to the nearest school, Mississippi Southern. He was turned down and harassed by the police, and finally somebody planted 5 stolen bags of chicken feed on his farm. The price of feed was raised to make the charge a felony, and Kennard was sentenced to 7 years at hard labor. When another Negro admitted stealing the feed, the white authorities told him to shut up. On New Year's Eve, from the stage of Mr. Kelly's in Chicago, I made a resolution for 1963. Get Kennard out of jail. I thought that if all the facts were dug up and printed in the newspapers, America would get Kennard out of jail. A white UPI reporter who came by to interview me was so upset by the story that he volunteered to go to Mississippi and gather more information. The first bit of information he dug up was that Clyde Kennard was dying of cancer. Irv Kupchenet, the famous Chicago columnist, broke the Kennard story. My new researcher came with Kennard's medical records and gave them to all the press. Kennard was transferred to the prison hospital. Then a Chicago millionaire called Business Connections in Mississippi, and Kennard was released from jail. He was 35 years old when we flew him to Chicago to start cancer treatment, but he looked 85. And it was too late. He died 6 months later. I met James Meredith that year, too, one of the most brilliant and courageous men in America, a man who gave dignity to every Negro in the country, who put every Negro in college, who played one of the biggest parts in setting up the revolution in the history of the American Negro struggle. Negroes looked a little different and acted a little different when James Meredith was graduated, because they all were graduating with him, graduated from the derogatory stigma that all Negroes are ignorant, that all Negroes are lazy, that all Negroes stink. So I'm just going to stop there.
That's profound. And, as Dick Gregory is doing the truth telling. He's telling the stories that people won't hear. And then the stories, that are rampant even today, where we see people are, like the young man who was arrested in New Jersey, and the police basically lied, and the camera actually showed the truth. So right. All of these stories that we hear, and even if this story to me is connected to one of Black Wall Street.
Right.
You think about people who were building their lives, and then they were interrupted by the justice systems, and even what Michelle Alexander talks about in her book, The New Jim Crow, where so many Black people, Black men, Black women, but particularly Black men at this period during the Jim Crow era were put back in slavery via the penal system, as a way for white folks to profit, or those landowners, or, places that convicts were leased to. Right.
Well, that's like I've said this, since as an adult, many of the things that people experienced in the 60s and during the time I was born really haven't changed. The police brutality haven't changed. The setting up of people haven't changed. All of these jail sentences and treatment of prisoners, ill treatment of prisoners haven't changed. Trumped up charges haven't changed. And as I get older, I'm like, when is this going to stop? And really quickly, just to shift a little bit to talk about, like the reparations situation. I started in that reparations situation 29 years ago with Representative John Conyers in 1989 when he first introduced the bill. And when I look at the roster of all of the people who have received reparations over the years, when is it going to be time for African Americans? When is all this brutality and violence going to stop? And we just have to just keep pushing. Some of us, we know this is a lifelong struggle.
You know, that was one of the comments that was made.